Right, well, we'll go ahead and get started. I know people are still joining. Welcome, come in. Thank you so much for joining our conversation today on providing affirming services to LGBTQ plus youth who are experiencing homelessness. I'm excited for this discussion today. My name is Jen Elder. I'm the director of the Homeless and Housing Resource Center. I just have a few housekeeping items to go over before we get started today. First, as a disclaimer, this webinar is a joint collaboration between the Homeless and Housing Resource Center and SAMHSA's Center of Excellence on LGBTQ Behavioral Health Equity. We are both funded by SAMHSA, but the views expressed today are those of the presenters and not necessarily SAMHSA or HHS. We do have interpretation and transcription today, so you will see our interpreters on the screen. We also have some brief instructions if you would like a live transcription through Zoom. If you have any technical difficulties, please don't hesitate to reach out to us at any time. So a few instructions. We have quite a few. We have almost 500 people so far joining us today. All participant lines are muted, not to worry there. And the chat feature is disabled. That just helps prevent that extra confusion that can happen sometimes when so many people are in a room. But that said, you can send questions, thoughts, kudos, anything you'd like to us through the Q&A feature. We'll make sure that those get to all of the panelists today. We do appreciate your time for taking a short evaluation following today's discussion. And if you'd like a certificate of participation for the webinar, you'll be automatically redirected there when you finish completing the evaluation. It's very short, just a few questions about your experience today. I'm joined by a great group of panelists. Unfortunately, I don't believe Milani Freeman will be able to join us today, but we do have Martel Okonji, the Director of Innovations for Safe Place for Youth, and Jesse Harris, Planning and Land Use Consultant with Brian Silveria and Associates. I will actually let them provide a much more comprehensive introduction of themselves. And just so you know, the structure of today, there's no PowerPoints beyond this. It's just a real great opportunity to ask the experts here about best practices for serving youth. We do appreciate all the questions that you submitted in advance for your registration. We've compiled those and we're going to address as many as we can today. So with that, I will try to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to the panelists.
All right. Thank you for that introduction, Jen. So as Jen said, my name is Jesse Harris. Any pronouns are fine. I actually started out working with disabled adults and moved to Los Angeles from North Carolina about 8 years ago and worked at the Youth Center on Highland with, which is a shelter and drop-in center for queer homeless youth. And so they prioritize services to LGBTQ youth who are experiencing homelessness and housing instability. Although everyone's welcome in the space as long as they're respectful. And if you'd like, we can talk a little bit about how to cultivate mixed spaces like that. From there, I kind of fell into the rabbit hole of what's wrong with LA's housing and how to fix it. And ended up getting a master's degree in urban planning from the University of Southern California, which I graduated from this May, and I'm now working as a development consultant. So I help to bring projects together to make sure that affordable housing is built in Los Angeles. I'm happy to come with this wide variety of expertise, including and especially the direct service that I have working with homeless LGBTQ youth. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Love to share space with you, Jesse. My name is Martel Okonji. I utilize all-inclusive pronouns. I am actually, someone who has experienced homelessness themselves. So I had about some lived experience for predominantly about, say, less than 2 years, which brought me into my work also with the Los Angeles LGBT Center and really navigating youth direct services more specifically our youth development, positive youth development, encompassing those frameworks within our work. How do we get more young people to engage in their education, independent living skills, career exploration, et cetera? And then through that, kind of continued to build in, took myself to really unpack through my academic lens the narratives of Black and Brown identities, which brought me into my current PhD program, which is how do organizations create the structures and implement the services and really engage in the work at a community level most effectively with our most underserved and vulnerable population. So I took a lot of work into that, and currently as our Director of Innovations at Safe Place for Youth, I spend a lot of my time creating the tools and the systems for our organization to be able to complete our strategic plan and really most effectively serve young people who are experiencing homelessness. So happy to be in this space and to share some of that expertise as well too, and to engage in some really strong dialogue. So happy to be here.
Great. Thank you both so much for joining us. We are so happy that you're here. So to start off our conversation on this, we know that there is an overrepresentation of LGBTQ youth who are experiencing housing instability, and there are disparities in the homeless and housing system. What, from your expertise and perspective, is contributing to that? What kind of factors are leading to this overrepresentation and the disparities that we're seeing in our system?
Well, one thing I'd like to address is that a lot of young people that we saw coming into the youth center were system involved. Sometimes young people get involved with what's called systems of care, which some folks might be familiar with. That's the juvenile justice system and what we call here in LA, the Department of Children and Family Services, but goes by different monikers in different places. Sometimes young people end up in those systems because of their LGBTQ identity. And sometimes I think oftentimes when they are involved in those systems, there's trouble finding permanency for them. And that, again, so when I was working at the youth center, actually, I worked with the RISE program, which provides training to system professionals. We provided a lot of training to the juvenile justice system professionals, and then also to the Department of Children and Family Services. And permanency is this concept, right, where if you have a young person, the first permanent connection that sort of naturally befalls that young person is their whatever family they came from, usually a biological family. If that family is not accepting, then that really limits the opportunities to place that young person with, say, a foster family or hopefully a more permanent connection. Foster families, a lot of foster families are not suitable places for LGBTQ young people. And unfortunately, those young people who are not able to find permanency in within that system of care often end up in the juvenile justice system, both directly as a result of not being able to find permanency through the foster care system, and also because, as you can imagine, if young people don't have strong, reliable, supportive, permanent connections, then it's very easy for them to become swept up in behaviors that could land them first in the juvenile justice system, and then unfortunately to graduate into the adult justice system, which filters through homeless systems, right? The same young people that we see in homeless shelters and drop-in centers are often part of the prison population as well. I don't know if you have anything that you wanted to add, Martel, especially regarding non-system involved youth.
Yeah, definitely. And even before I even sharing that, I think one piece that I tend to always forget to express or navigate in that conversation in terms of like representation are the Black and Brown young people who actually are in the closet or what we say DL that actually don't get counted for in the conversation. And I think that's one thing that we always have to be mindful of is like, especially those who are navigating through the incarceration system, the juvenile justice system, right? Recognizing that sexuality is not a conversation that they could have. And even from their own communities, like sexuality is taboo. So how that shows up in the way that they're navigating homelessness is like what resources or services are they navigating? How do we leave space and grace for them to also come to terms with that? So I had a young person when I was working at the LGBT Center that always told everyone that he was straight, he didn't identify as gay. And we had a one-on-one through an episode that he had, an encounter that he had that like really traumatized him, and like he became much more vulnerable, but yet the rapport we were building. And he shared that, and he was like, you know, the hardest part is, even though I'm in this center that is safe space for LGBT folks, like I still can't come to terms with my own sexuality. And he's like, and it's even more challenging because if I'm told that I'm also exhibiting homophobia or transphobia, I'm trying to navigate all these different things at the same time. So I'm always like, how do we kind of hold space and grace? And then also really expectations on how he has to navigate within that space as well too. So I wanted to say that as well. As like, that's a huge population that sometimes we're not cognizant of, and want to hold space for them as well. But then also, yeah, I think Jesse pointed out all those strong points, where I always say like folks run away from home because of the fact that it's not safe, because of the fact that they can't actually feel like they could be themselves within that. So even noticing like I would choose homelessness in order to be me, authentically me. So I think that's another component that we recognize when we talk about, you know, those runaway and homeless youth. That's a piece that is like, I want to find this chosen family that's going to show up for me so I can really, really be able to be me and be authentic, and be able to live the life that I choose. So I think there's so many different pieces that bring into that overrepresentation, especially even when we talk about, you know, generational trauma, and how that also shows up in the space as well too. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I also would add that for young people who, whether they run away from home or they are emancipated, right, including young people over the age of 18. So a few helpful figures from the youth center. Stably from year to year, about 30 to 40% of our population came from systems of care, right, juvenile justice system, or from the Department of Child and Family Services. And then stably year to year, 25 to 30% of those young people actually came from other states. And I would like to point out that young people, so one, if you're a young trans woman in Kansas, being homeless in LA may seem like a much better option than being housed in Kansas. That said, young people who identify on the LGBTQ plus spectrum and are looking to form independent, what we call in urban planning, forming households. They're looking to go out on their own, you know, have a job, rent a place, or buy a home or something like that. That's oftentimes really hard for young people, especially trans and gender nonconforming young people, to have the skills to be able, those skills aren't necessarily talked about. And then there's dual skills, right? Because you also need the employer, the potential employer, to have the skills to interact with LGBTQ young people. And again, especially trans and non-binary young people, it can be really difficult, really intimidating to walk into a job interview when the name on the paper is Jessica, and the name that you identify with is Devante, right? Like there's so much explaining that has to happen, and so much that as a young person they have to come to terms with and be comfortable with and confident about, that it can make it really difficult for them to be able to establish that the economic independence that is the foundation of being able to live a well-rounded and fully actualized life.
Yeah, and the last thing I'll add too, I think what really makes it so much more challenging for like our LGBTQ youth, especially in terms of just accessing services, is just knowing that they actually can. I think that's one of those ways where, you know, when we talk about pronouns, when we talk about having verbal sign, like the way that we engage in conversations with our young people by asking those things, the signage that we have within our spaces, the music that is even played at the front desk when folks are even engaging in services that the staff are listening to. So I think there's so many things that say like, hey, is this a safe space for me to engage with, right? We forget that young people's lives, especially all young people experiencing homelessness lives, are at stake every single night, right? So when we start to add in the different identities that start to create and really allow the authenticity of that young person, we notice that it becomes much more, the more vulnerable they are, the more risk that they have to take. So it's always that option of like, is this the risk that I'm going to take just to grab a meal for this day, just to be able to have somewhere to sleep? So how are we also looking at our spaces and saying like, hey, who are we really opening our doors for? And how do we ensure that it's much more inclusive? How do we ensure that there are more signages in the bathrooms, that we do have a specific bathroom just for folks who are identifying with the trans experience, that we do open up beds that are specific for trans identities as well too, and really work on not just having a space within our centers so that way they can be safe and like they don't have to worry about those folks who are navigating and do not understand and have that fear of something different. How do we also educate those folks so we can talk about the integration of what that could look like as we all work together, right? I think sometimes we forget that, you know, Black and white folks weren't even able to sit in the same classroom together. So we're talking about how do we have folks really learn and understand differences, so then that way we can all talk about how we celebrate each other and really recognize what that looks like. So I think there's a purpose for having these different spaces so folks can actually exist and be able to get the needs met. And then there's also the next step of how do we start educating folks and creating that, not just here's a lecture, here's a discussion, but here's a celebration. We all learn best when we're celebrating, when we're taking down and sharing and breaking bread. So how do we put in more opportunities for us to celebrate identities and different ways that we can honor each other?
Yeah, totally. I think a lot of that is also, in youth development, the programming that's included. One of the things that we did at the youth center was, I think it was twice a year we would do this thing. It was a big fashion show. So a lot of young people, especially LGBTQ young people, have never seen themselves in the clothing, in the mirror, looking the way that they identify. And it is a game changer. I'll tell you from personal experience. I think the first time that I put on, when I maybe in my early 20s, finally was like, okay, how am I going to dress when I graduate from college and I go to job interviews? Am I going to wear a women's pantsuit? That doesn't really fit me. I had never, put on a men's suit. And I went to the thrift store and I bought a men's suit and I came home and I put it on and it was way too big, but still looking in the mirror, I felt like I was like, yeah, I could walk into an interview with this with a button-up shirt and men's professional pants. And it just gave me so much confidence. And obviously in that age range, and I think someone in the chat asked about age range. So at the youth center, we saw our doors were open to young people from ages 14 to 24. Most of the folks who came in were aged 19 to 24. We didn't provide housing services to young folks under the age of 18 because there's an agreement with the Los Angeles Homeless Services that those folks will go to another organization that specializes in providing housing services to minors. So that said, a lot of the young people that we're referring to are actually, over the age of 18, but still within that developmental stage where they need a lot of, I would tell the young people when they came in, oftentimes when they were disappointed with themselves for wherever place they were in their lives, you're an adult with training wheels on. You still need a lot of, right? When you think about, growing up and learning to ride a bike, if you did, when you fell off the bike, there was typically someone there to help you brush off the bruises and help you figure out what you did wrong and say, okay, try again. You did really well with this, and that. I want to see you try it again. And you get to build confidence. When young people are kind of thrust into the world and especially thrust into systems of care, which are ironically named, then sometimes they don't get that sort of those training wheels. They don't get that person who's like, it's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to still be learning your boundaries and what your needs are. And so providing a youth development space that can effectively do that. And so that's where I feel like this fashion show was really helpful because we're in Los Angeles, right? There's a plethora of makeup professionals and stylists and all kinds of people who are in the showbiz industry. And our shelter and drop-in center was through the LGBT Center, which is a very large, old, and well-renowned organization. So we had a lot of volunteers, and we would have volunteers come in. They would do the young people's makeup. They would style them. They would style their hair. And then at the end of at the end of the day, they would have, right before dinner, we would have a fashion show. And literally just being appreciated in the clothing that they identify with, right, that they see themselves in, you just see such a huge improvement in their confidence, which goes a really, really long way in helping them to do the things that they need to do. You needed to go to the DMV and get your ID anyway, but it's hard to walk into that space and be in front of all those eyes and not feel yourself. It feels like embarrassing or something. Like I can't do that. I can't walk in there and talk to these professionals. They're going to ask me all these questions. They're going to ask me, about the sex that was assigned at birth, and maybe there's some judgment there that they're afraid of. And I think really being able to have a space where young people are allowed to feel themselves and allowed to build that confidence, and especially in the eyes of their peers, of other young people, it's huge. We used to also do karaoke on Fridays out in the big, so we had this big day room, but it was kind of the living room of the center. And that too, I mean, it's a doubly, it gives young people an opportunity to say, hey, this is the kind of music I like. And young people love to do that. They love to talk about, in general, they really appreciate the opportunity for someone to listen, to care about who they are. But then it also gives an opportunity for other young people in that space to clap and say, yes, we like it. You did a good job. We approve of who you are. And that could possibly be one of the biggest factors in our mental health as human beings, because we are such social animals. A lot of these young people haven't been clapped for, haven't been congratulated for maybe anything ever, but certainly not since they were in school. And many of them are no longer in school. And so they haven't been provided with any kind of accolades. And that can be really hard on their esteem.
These are really fantastic ideas. From what you both had touched on about unique needs and ways to create a safe, supportive environment, these have been like fantastic tips. We had a few questions come in before the webinar, really about starting from that square one. I think I felt through the questions, maybe there's nervousness about how do we start conversations. People are worried about, the word came up a few times, offensive. They're afraid of saying the wrong thing. And so they're not sure what to say, how to start conversations with youth, how to ask about pronouns, and how to really create that safe space. So what are your advice for like key takeaways of where to start?
Yeah, the first thing I'll say is that I think Jesse also hinted on this really importantly, is like, even when us starting our own narrative, it was the same questions on like, where do I start? Like, what does that look like? So I always say that the first approach is like, have an open mind and move in the journey with the person, and don't give them their expectation or their outcome. Like, really start with where they are. And I think that's like so critically important. Like, even for me, like, I think navigating in my own journey and even navigating with youth, like, it was really big. And for me in my learning and understanding like the trans experience. Like, I was like, okay, I have to now see, like, how do I approach my own family that identifies as a trans experience, so I can therefore understand how I can best work with them. And that really starts with, like, where are you at in your own journey? Like, what does that look like for you? How do I support you? Asking those questions to start with them, and not necessarily try to run ahead, try to save lives, have that savior complex, but really more so like it's a partnership. I think if we start recognizing, like, when we're working with young people, if we're not partnering with them, and what does a partnership look like, right? That means that we have to communicate just in our relationships. We got to communicate. What do you want me to do for you? What does that look like? How do we work together? How do you know our relationships can be struggling and is not healthy? So I think it really starts with like exploring each other and understanding like, how do we move together? And then the most important part is I always say, like, if there isn't, and sometimes I think like, oh, I don't want to put this sign up because why do I want to put this sign up? Like, we got to also remember, like, folks are just starting to find their story, find their stories. So like creating that type of signage, like all those small and not the real work, it's a part of that process of beginning the work. So I also want to always highlight that as well too. And I'll go ahead and let Jesse take the rest of that as well.
Yeah, this was actually a question that we got a lot especially, from the professionals and systems of care. One thing I do want to point out is that young people involved in systems of care, including the homeless system, are used to being asked a lot of questions. And I too, when I first started at the youth center, we had this intake packet that was a few pages long of questions. And then on top of that, one of the positions that I had at the youth center was as the health education specialist, which basically meant that I was talking to young people about sex and drugs all day. And so a young person comes into my office and I'm like, so have you had any sexual partners lately? And did you use protection? And they're like, wait, I ain't even had lunch yet. But I find at first I was always nervous that these young people would be like offended or put off that I was asking these questions. Honestly, they're very, very used to being asked questions about themselves. So I think that if we, like Martel said, if we go into it kind of confidently, able to ask the question and ensure that, that we're asking what we mean to be asking, then I think there's very little chance that a young person is going to say, hey, why would you ask me that? The second tip that I can give, especially around pronouns and kind of that introductory information, is to offer yours first. So if I sit down and I say, my name's Jesse, I use she, her, hers pronouns, what do you go by? Then a lot of young people aren't really going to know what you even mean by pronouns. So it keeps them from thinking that you're like talking over them or that you're asking them for something that you're not asking them for, or having to clarify, which can be awkward if it's in a first meeting. But then it also shows them that this is the standard. And that's something that we did a lot in the youth center, was like, everyone who comes in, we ask what their name and pronouns are, and we respect pronouns in here. I mean, people could get, sent away for the day. I also want to say we had a low barrier, high tolerance programming throughout. So, there oftentimes we would try to have conversations with people, but there were real consequences for dishonoring someone's pronouns, because it was meant to show that this is the space in which everyone gets to live their truth. And so if young people realize that that's a part of the space, again, they're less likely to be offended by the question, because they understand that it's so that they can be fully honored in this space. And then the last thing I'll say is that if you can apply it uniformly, don't just ask the young people that you think are trans or non-binary what their pronouns are. If you, again, follow that introduction template where you introduce yourself with your name and pronouns and whatever other information, introductory information you're going to ask of that young person. I'm from X, Y, and Z. I live over in the K-Town. Where did you spend the night last night? That was something that we were often interested in when young people came in. Is like, where did you sleep last night? Was it outside? Was it in a bed? So introducing ourselves with some requisite information really helped to feel like it was a level playing field, and help that young person feel like they weren't being interrogated, and certainly like they weren't being targeted based on their gender expression around pronouns or anything else. Because of course you could have a young person. I do want to respond that we would often get a follow-up question to that, right? So what if you asking all youth their pronouns, what if we have a cisgender, meaning that they identify with the sex they were assigned at birth, young person come in, which happens often, right? And I ask them their pronouns and they're offended. It's a learning opportunity. Again, these young people, it's okay for them. I think it's completely okay, natural and expected for them to be put off by something if no one's ever asked them about that before. So you can easily, there's a short phrase like, I just want to know so I can respect. So I can make sure that I'm respecting the name that you go by, right? People get really touchy about pronouns, but I like to think of a pronoun as a linguistic nickname, right? It's basically the name that I need to call you that has a syntactical function anytime I don't want to use your full name, right? Martel's self went to Martel's, and I think people generally understand that. So I think if people can understand it as like, I need to know your name and I need to know your nickname, I need to know what linguistic nickname to use for you in conversation. And I want that to be respectful. And oftentimes the cis young people, after they hear that explanation, will say, okay, well, I don't care then, and they are no longer offended by the question, because you've been able to build an understanding. That also has the other effect of meaning that they are more likely to show respect to other people's pronouns, because now they understand why it's important. right? I too have pronouns that I want people to respect, or I at least understand why people ask about. And so, you know, when I go out into the world, I can pay that forward.
Thanks, this is really helpful. A quick clarifying question that just came in. When you just mentioned you had a low barrier, high tolerance program, someone had asked for just some clarification on what that meant.
Yeah, glad you asked. It basically means that, you know, when people walk in the door, it's a welcoming space. People can come. There's not a high barrier to get in. I think what could be helpful is giving an example of the opposite. Let's say, you know, a private university. They have a high barrier, low tolerance, right? So the barrier to get in, you probably have to take, you know, an LSAT, a GRE test, or some kind of screening exam. You need to have high grades. You need to come to an interview, and you need to be dressed a particular way, and you need to carry yourself a particular way, right? So they have a really high barrier for entry into that program. And then if you mess up, right, say you fail a class, or you miss a certain amount of classes, or anything, right, it's competitive. So you may no longer have a place in that program. So we mean the opposite, basically. It's loose in here. You can come in here no matter who you are, no matter how you're dressed, no matter how. Oftentimes we had young people come. You know, we're supposed to be cultivating a space for people who are between the ages of 14 and 24, which is a super valuable thing, right? When young people mix with adults, especially I think in populations that where resources are scarce, there can be, unfortunately, really predatory relationships that form. So not to say that there aren't predatory relationships between other young people, but they're on a similar level of life experience and sort of figuring that out. I think there's something different that happens when young people are in a space with adults who have all this experience and, you know, can kind of use that against them. So that said, we did have young people come in. How do we verify that someone is between the age of 14 and 24? That's part of the low barrier, is that, okay, you can come in, we're going to give you a voucher to go to the DMV and get an ID. You need to get that ID so that we can verify that you can continue getting services here. But at no point would we say, you know, because you don't have an ID, you can't come in. Sorry, you know, you're too old. I mean, unless the person was clearly like a 55, in which case we could still help connect them to services. But the point is that, you know, we didn't say, here's a list of things that you need in order to get services here. It was, you know, if you're between the ages of 14 and 24, come on in, you can get services here. And be respectful. And even the tolerance, you know, even people, we obviously have rules, and it's really important that people uphold those rules. Part of what we did in the intake process was discuss the rights and responsibilities, the agreements that young people had to make in order to continue getting services there. And it was stuff like, you know, respecting other people's pronouns, respecting staff, things like that. And it was a discussion. It wasn't like, you know, you better make sure you do. But it was a discussion to help young people understand why those things were important. And obviously at the intake, when people are coming into the youth center, it is maybe the worst day of your life. This could be the day that you lost housing. At any rate, you're probably in a crisis period. And so that is to say, at that point in the introduction, they would pretty much agree to anything, right? To be able to come in and get a meal and a hot shower and some fresh clothes. So we didn't get a whole lot of pushback on those agreements. The enforcement of those agreements is where I think the high tolerance comes in, is being super understanding. I think Martell is going to talk about a couple of frameworks that kind of complement or supplement like this trauma-informed care model that folks are familiar with, but being super understanding of where young people are coming from. You know, there are behaviors that we expect to see among young people experiencing homelessness. Those behaviors alone are not likely to get you permanently suspended from the center. And even if you do, I was part of the outreach team for about a year, and we will meet you outside with resources. Even if you have been kicked out of our center, we will come to where you are. There are a few, you know, hot spots, places around the area where we know homeless young people hang out, and we will make sure that your needs are still being met.
Yeah, Jesse, and just even one thing I'll do, and I'll kind of share some of those frameworks to dive into that, which will be really useful for folks. one thing I also have to just share about that low barrier, high tolerance. A great example of that, I was working with a young person who we were finally getting housing, and I was so excited. They went to go do their intake. And through the intake, the case manager called me because he came back and he was struggling, and he said, yo, can you talk to the case manager? She wants to talk to you because they're asking me to get a psychiatric evaluation. I've been working with this member for a few months, and no, I was not a case manager, I was a youth development coordinator. So sometimes for some of our young people who are like, you know, I have my case manager, and yet also I would prefer to work with you because of there's triggers that I'm experiencing, and it's just going to be much easier for me to process this. So I would sometimes have a case plan of like 3 to 5, but it wasn't my priority. So I say that because sometimes we also want to recognize low barrier, high tolerance is if we have staff who are able to do case plans, we can also support and navigate so that young person can get their needs met. So I say that in the sense of the person called me back. They said they did their intake. They were concerned about their trauma that they've experienced, and they want them to get a psychiatric evaluation because they feel like there might be some sociopathic behaviors. And for me, it blew my mind as like, this is a barrier. There was a barrier. Why? Because one, the person was assuming because they were navigating trauma on a daily basis. And for them, it was like, this is my day to day. Like I've experienced gang violence, I've experienced community violence, right? Like that's something like when we talk about community psychology, we understand that there's a lot of violence that folks can experience and be normalized to that violence. So where it's like, all right, I might experience some trauma, but yet this is what my life looks like, right? So we talk about that learned helplessness as well too. So in all of that, they were saying that they have to get a psychiatric evaluation if they want to get into this housing program. Now we all know you cannot get a psychiatric evaluation the same exact day. So the next appointment that was available was about 2-3 weeks out. This person didn't have housing, so we're talking about the longer you're staying on the streets, the more trauma you experience, the worse that your situation gets, right? So it was one of those things that fortunately, you know, we called someone else and we just lied and said they're having suicidal thoughts. But yet then that also impacts the psychiatric evaluation. Person got it in, the evaluation cleared, and then they were saying, like, okay, cool, well, we'll bring them into our housing program. That to me was already something that I want to talk about because, you know, that young person did experience the juvenile detention centers and navigated through that and then experienced some other things that happened while they were out on the streets late at night. And for me, it was almost like a complete disconnect that you're creating more barriers for the young people who are accessing your services as if you don't know what they navigate on a daily basis. So it's being really mindful of like, how are we setting up the intakes? How do we set up the programs that we want folks to engage in, our housing programs that are based upon the experiences that our young people go through each and every single day. And it's like being mindful of that as we set up these different ways that our young people can navigate. So through that, like, yeah, as Jesse had mentioned, you know, a lot of us, if not, are familiar with trauma-informed care. And I think that's something that folks should really look upon, and we'll make sure to get some of that stuff out. And if not, there's also positive youth development, which is really being intentional in the ways that we engage our young people by really capturing their strengths. And there's a concept of like 40 internal and external assets that we want to work on so a young person can have the ability to independently live. And have all the skills and tools to be competent, form connections with adults and caring adults and peers, really have this sense of compassion towards their peers, a sense of character between what is right and wrong, and then also a sense of confidence so they know what they're doing as well too. So all of that, like positive development and trauma-informed care, along with you know, some other components and frameworks, brought me to this framework that I call healing-centered engagement. And a lot of us are always talking like, how do we, you know, really bring young people into this work? How do we recognize the trauma that's happening and really start moving folks out of that trauma? For me, this framework really captured that. As someone who was like very intentional when we talk about social and racial equity, when we talk about bringing young people and identifying that all of them can participate in their pathways to success, right? It shouldn't just be the case manager or the program coordinator doing this work. It should really be a partnership, as I've said prior. So this framework was really more about like, how do we recognize that, especially from an LGBT lens, right? One, it's not clinical, it's political, right? we're talking about young people having like the engagement and advocacy efforts, right? So the point of that is if LGBTQ youth are engaging in efforts that are saying like, we need more housing for young people, we need organizations to recognize that trans identities exist and we need more services and programs for them, and they're getting connected to that and advocating, we're also recognizing that this is a systems challenge. Like this is not that person's fault on why they're where they're at in their lives. And I think that's so critically important for LGBTQ folks to know, because there's a lot of self-blame that like, if I wasn't gay, I wouldn't be going through this. If I didn't have a trans identity, I wouldn't be going through this. And a lot of folks are always like, well, you're choosing this, you're choosing this. It's like, I'm choosing to be me. That's the only choice I have in this process. So it's really recognizing that and taking that self-blame off of them, which I think is so, so valuable and so important. And then, you know, we talk about this cultural grounding, which is the next component of that framework. So we can really say like, okay, cool. If I'm recognizing like the pathways of where I am and how I got to where I'm at, I'm also going to be able to understand that at a deeper context. I'm going to know like, who am I as a Black gay man navigating in this space? And like, what does that mean when I celebrate Black History Month? How do I do more activities that surround me so I can learn to love my own skin that I'm in? Better yet, then I could say, okay, cool, we have this day of silence. I've had peers who had committed suicide. And it's so important that I recognize the different components of why that comes and what that looks like, and celebrating and giving honor to those lives so I can empower myself to say, how do I change more things from that, right? We have Pride History Month. So all these different days are not just to be there for the sake of being there, but we're really recognizing like, how do we celebrate? How do we honor? And providing more space for all of us to really connect to that as well too. And then as I said before, which positive youth development really brings into, is like really recognizing like this assets base. How do we look at from a strengths-based perspective, right? Everyone can contribute something. If we look at young people like they are not able to contribute, we're doing a disservice to them. Everyone has a strength. So how do we capture one of those strengths, really be able to explore it, and then allow them to apply that to even areas that they need to grow in? So it's one of those other components that I say like, that it doesn't also mean to say, to disregard our trauma, right? I think we always focus on like this trauma-informed care, and it's like, what's your trauma doing? And how do we move from your trauma? It's just really just saying more of like, what do you want to achieve? How do we focus on that? And we know you have this trauma, yet what are also these strengths that can help you navigate that trauma, right? And Sean Ginwright in the article that I'm going to have sit inside of the chat box if we could, it goes into this quote of like, I am more than just my trauma. And that's what a young person was saying. And I think if we allow folks to stop feeling like their trauma is the only thing that they can pull from, we're saying like, yo, but you're also like on these streets and you're also being able to sell certain things. Right? It may be illegal. And we want to recognize that and give them the context of that. But you're out there hustling. You're out there being able to do these things. So how can you pull that into your case plan? Right? Like, how do we make this into an art form for you so you can hustle and grind and get that stuff done? And then the last piece that I think is like really important, so very, very important, right? Healing Center engagement recognizes that we're all in a community, and it's not just a young person going through this, it's also the provider. It's also the community that young person's navigating. So if we don't have providers who are practicing what we call, me and my colleagues, everyday healing, then we're also not going to be able to support that young person. So the way you show up in work is what that young person's also going to recognize and see, right? We talk about these mirror neurons that actually exist. Whatever you're doing, that young person's also absorbing and taking in. So we got to be mindful in the ways we show up to work. When you can't show up, don't show up. You're doing a disservice to that young person, right? When we talk about leaders in organizations, when we talk about folks who own their own consulting businesses as therapists, how are you ensuring that people have adequate amounts of pay, adequate amounts of time off, so we can support folks, right? We are talking about a vulnerable population. We are talking about folks who got to go on TV, and sometimes, you know, the only type of celebration that they're doing is the trans experienced folks who's experiencing sex work. when they're not even seeing the trans experienced folks who are actually doctors and who are actually doing a lot more work inside of our fields and are getting the esteem that they can also see and be like, wow, that's beautiful. How do I see that? How do I be that? So, right. So I want to make sure that we recognize that it's not just our young people that we have to support. It's also ourselves. It's also the folks that we work with. And we have to do this as a community to be able to get this work moving forward. And our young people deserve the bare minimum of just that, which is so much more, right?
Yeah. I saw a couple of questions in the chat, and I'm going to try to hit a lot of them at once. So one question that I see coming up is, what are the consistent issues with the foster homes and finding permanency? A lot of folks who get involved as foster parents for DCFS are sourced from religious communities, and that's not to say that people from religious communities cannot be suitable and appropriate placements for LGBTQ youth, but a lot of religious communities do have biases against LGBTQ identities, and so it could range from them saying, like, I don't want a gay youth in my home, to them accepting a gay youth, but not being able to build the connection that's actually going to be super helpful for that young person. Studies show, and I'm sure that a lot of folks in here know this, but this is something that stuck with me, working in direct service, and then continues to stick with me throughout my life. The number one factor in whether a young person gets involved with systems or becomes involved in becomes a parent at an early age, or all of what we call these life outcomes, is whether or not they have a close, positive relationship with a trusted adult in that critical age range of 13 to 17. And that, when I think about it, I'm like, oh yeah, that makes so much sense. A trusted adult. And so what's hard about a lot of the foster homes, but even to branch out from there, people who are not involved in systems of care and are not thinking about permanency placement, is being able to have that close relationship. It's one thing to provide a roof over someone's head, but if you are not that person with whom they can have a close, positive, trusting relationship and talk about who they are and what they're experiencing and all of the things that come with growing up, and especially growing up with an LGBTQ plus identity, then that is going to be difficult for improving the outcomes of that young person. And in fact, unfortunately, it could hinder the outcomes of that young person, because the messaging that they're getting in that permanent home is blaming, shaming, excluding, and name calling. Those were the behaviors in the RISE program that we listed out that were studies have found are especially harmful to the esteem of LGBTQ young people, right? So I'll name them again. It's blaming, shaming, excluding, and name calling. So I think the name calling one is pretty easy. Blaming and shaming, Martel touched on, right? Well, you wouldn't be going through X, Y, or Z if you just weren't gay, or if you would just be a regular girl or something, right? Young people and adults, but especially young people who are forming their identity and just kind of getting to understand their own moral compass of the world and themselves, they internalize that messaging, right? And so they think of themselves as bad, and that can lead them, that can definitely lead them down a really harmful path. So, recognizing that the number one factor is that close, positive relationship with a trusted adult, I think kind of ties a lot into the programming that we were trying to produce at the center, where it was, of course, that low barrier, high tolerance, and also programming that's geared toward youth. One of the things that we had was a youth ambassador program, which we were really proud of. There were, I think, 9 seats on the ambassador program in total. And it was an opportunity for young people to have a say over what happens in the center. It was basically like a consulting board for the center. We want to see this kind of programming. We think there's a problem with only offering breakfast from 7 a.m. to 9 a.m. We want to expand it by an extra half hour. We'll help out to distribute giving young people responsibilities goes back to what Martel was talking about recognizing their strengths. And that's super important. I think there could be sort of a, we all want to, I know when a young person comes in and they are in a point of crisis or they're super traumatized, I kind of want to coddle them, right? And don't worry about anything. I'll grab this, I'll do this, I'll do this. But we have to recognize that also part of the training wheels thing is that at some point you got to ride this bike on your own with no training wheels. And so recognizing their strengths, putting them in leadership positions. One really important factor there is being able to compensate them for that leadership position. I think that can be complicated, especially depending on the program you're working in. And so we would try to find creative ways to provide compensation. We weren't allowed to give cash money to young people who come into the center. That might be different depending on, what programs people are working with or working within. But we would give gift cards, and they all knew how to redeem the gift cards for cash anyway. That wasn't the intention of the gift cards, but it gave them some flexibility in saying, like, it's a little patronizing to say, we're going to give you this t-shirt or give you this. We want to give you a resource that's going to help you to connect with what you identify as your own needs, because that's a skill that you need in adulthood. But I also do want to recognize that there's a place for these young people to be young people. And even though the majority of the folks coming to the Youth Center on Highland for services were aged 19 to 24, many of them hadn't really had an opportunity to finish out childhood. And so developmentally, they may very well be, 12, 13, 14, 15. And so, we had a program called Recess where we would literally just go outside and play for about 1 to 2 hours once a week. Just go outside and play. We play soccer, we play basketball, we play tag, we play whatever. We're just out in the park, and these are young people having a good time. And it also gave us an opportunity, folks who are running programs with services directly for homeless young people might recognize that there is an impact on the surrounding community and surrounding community members, especially for us. So we were on a commercial street, but right behind us was just purely residential. Including a school that I think had like kindergarten through middle school or something like that. So that is to say that there were a lot of families and there were a lot of parents in the neighborhood who were sharing this neighborhood space with the homeless young people. And they tended to see the young people as not as kids, not as young people. Their kids are kids. These young people are monsters, horrible, vagrants. And I think going outside to play, just playing in the park, gave them also a chance to see these young people as young people, right? And to see the process that they're going through and that they are still growing up. And I think that was really valuable for helping to mitigate some of the impacts on the surrounding community. Another program that we had that was I found super useful for young people, especially for young people who didn't have any job experience, which of course can be one of the big factors in limiting young people's independence once they become emancipated through whatever means they become emancipated, is that I've never had a job before. And if you go to a job interview, you never had a job before, they're going to ask you about, well, we're looking for someone with some experience. Well, where do I get that experience if I've never, it's like it's a catch-22 all over the place. So we had an internship program, and young people could sign up for the internship program. They would get linked with clothing, job training, and then they could work with us, right, as people providing services as interns. They got paid for that work. So through that program, they were allowed to be compensated. And, they had a schedule. They had to show up at a particular time. They could use the facilities, but they needed to be showered and dressed. They needed to have a professional demeanor. And I find that they showed up for that opportunity a lot. They showed up for that opportunity, partially at least, probably because they were getting paid for it, but also because they were trusted in that position. And that, giving someone trust helps to make them trustworthy, especially for young people. So, and then of course it gave them a job that they could put on their resume, some experience that they could put on their resume, and a reference to say, yes, I worked with this person. Yes, they showed up to work. Yes, they were, and helps them kind of give them that springboard out into future employment. So those are some of the like concrete programs. I think that, depending on the needs of the young people, based on the social, political, and geographical forces at play for each of each of you out in the audience, there could be ways to form that to be appropriate to meet the needs of the population that you're serving.
Yeah, I'll say this, and I know, Jen, I'll pass it right to you, as I know we're at time. Just in terms of that Youth Advisory Council Board, the thing that made it really incredibly important that I tell every person that wants to have a Youth Advisory Board is make it a developmental program as your foundation piece. It's so important that we don't just bring young people to the table and expect them to perform, because that's exploitative behavior. We want to be able to give them the tools for success. And as Jesse mentioned, like having the opportunity to, like, I might not have had a job before, but being in this developmental program where I learned all these pieces, I had opportunities to engage in programs, to create things, to be able to have task and leadership components within all of these different assets and understand a lot of these different pieces allows them more things to speak from. So like really want to recognize that it's more than just show up, do a meeting, sit at the table with adults and make decisions. It's understanding yourself within that process, understanding the community that you serve, learning skills to facilitate, to create meetings, how to manage money, all these different things that I put inside of that program and worked with Jesse to really make sure it wasn't just an advisory council, it was a leadership development program that also served as an advisory council. And they showed up and was ready, which was the greatest part about it.
Thanks so much. I think that's really a fantastic way to wrap up our hour today, is really, leaving us thinking about the strengths-based approach, the healing-centered engagement, the utilizing youth strengths as a voice to say, what's not working? How can we help change this system? Because they absolutely have expertise that we should be using and acknowledging in an authentic way that is just so fantastic, so powerful. So I will say we had a lot of great questions come into the chat before. I could sit here and like listen to this conversation for another few hours. I know we all could, but out of respect for our panelist time, we will have to end at the end of this hour, but huge thanks to Jesse and Martel for their time, for their expertise. I have learned so much. I know that our community's really benefited from this. There's a lot we didn't get to. And so we're going to take this back between our two SAMHSA centers and see about how we can provide some follow-up materials. Maybe this is another conversation that we can come back. I'm volunteering everybody for more of these. Maybe this is another conversation we can come back, because I think that we all have so much to learn and we want to do good for young adults. And so this has just been a fantastic hour. One last thing is we do have an evaluation. Zoom should redirect you just after this, but Kevin James will put the link into the chat for that evaluation. We really appreciate your thoughts, and you'll receive a certificate of participation for the webinar. Right upon completion of that, you'll be redirected. So again, just huge thanks to Jesse and Martel, to our interpreters. This has just been a wonderful hour, and thank you all for joining us. Take care, and we will talk to you next time.